Hello and welcome to the launch of the documentary Cork Through the Barracks, produced by the Cork-based production company Frameworks Films. It is very fitting that this documentary is being shown tonight on the 18th of May 2021, exactly 100 years to the day that the British garrison withdrew from what was then Victoria Barracks and heralded a new era for what then became Collins Barracks, Cork. This documentary tells the story of the barracks and what a key role it has played in all of the major historic events in Cork over the past 2 centuries. In particular, it will outline the part that the barracks played during the revolutionary period in Cork and in the formation of a new Ireland. While the first half of the documentary tells the history of the barracks, the second half tells the story of the barracks today and provides the viewer with an insight into day-to-day life in Collins Barracks. I'm delighted that you've all been able to join us for this premiere screening, and it gives me great pleasure to now formally launch the documentary Cork Through the Barracks. Thank you.
Collins Barracks, Cork is the oldest and largest military installation in the south of Ireland. Its story is intertwined with that of Cork, of Ireland, of Europe, and indeed the world. But the story of the barracks is more than just a story of bricks and mortar. It is also the story of its garrison. Over the years, thousands of young men and women from Cork and all parts of Ireland passed through the barrack gates and went on to take part in many of the historical events that shaped the world we live in today. This is the story of Collins Barracks, and it is also their story.
There is a huge affinity between Collins Barracks and the personnel and institutions of Cork City and County. And that goes right back to the history. It should be noted that Cork City and its surrounding area is the second largest catchment area as regards recruitment in the country, and that continues to this day.
All military developments occur in response to what is perceived as a threat, and in that regard, the story of Collins Barracks is no different. Situated here in Cork is part of the history of the city. Cork itself was believed to have been founded around the year 600 as a monastic settlement by St. Finbar, the patron saint of the city. 200 or so years later, around 820 or something, the Vikings invaded. And after that, they settled and mixed with the population. It soon became strategically significant because of its large harbour. And it became necessary to garrison those troops, which essentially were an occupying force. So the first purpose-made garrison or fort for the English troops at the time was in a place called Skiddy's Castle on the North Main Street. And like I said, that was in the heart of what was then Cork City. Of course, it consisted of North and South Main Street. But as the city grew, the need to increase the number of troops, English troops based in the city, also grew. And around 1601, a fort was built just outside the south gates of its city, named Elizabeth Fort, after the Queen who was on the throne at the time, Queen Elizabeth. But towards the end of the 18th century, that had fallen into disrepair. And as well as that, as I said at the start, there was a perceived threat, because in 1789, the French Revolution broke out with its philosophy of liberty, equality, fraternity for all. And the crowned heads of Europe felt very threatened by this. And England and other nations of Europe went to war with revolutionary France. And Cork, as I said, because of its strategic location, because of its large port, was identified as one place that had to be garrisoned very strongly. The barrack square itself occupies an area of land known originally as the Fort Field. It's located in the townland of Rathmore, which translated to English means Great Fort, and it's believed to have been the site of an ancient Gaelic fortress. So in many ways, it's appropriate that the current barracks occupies that site. The square itself is over around 4 acres in area, and it's reputed to be the largest enclosed barracks square in Europe. Work on the barracks itself commenced in September 1801 and finished in May 1806. And after the barracks was finished and occupied by its first garrison, one of the architects, John Gibson, decided to install this little panel behind me on the wall of what was then the barrack guardroom, which is now the Barrack Museum, recording the actual building of the barracks and the extent of ground in which it occupied. And when it was completed, it was able to hold over 2,000 troops and over 200 cavalry as well. It had a small infirmary and living quarters and things like that, a barrack square on which to train, a guard room and stores, and all the buildings necessary for soldiers to live in and to train in. And once the barracks was built, it, unlike other barracks in the country, it didn't become a home to any particular British regiment. It became a staging post, and that's to say, an installation where soldiers going to and from the different wars throughout the 19th century. The British garrison, the young men who joined the British Army at the time, would have trained here in the barracks, here on the square, and went on then to take part in some of the major battles that were fought in Europe. So battles such as Waterloo, battles that were fought in the Crimean War, the charge of the Light Brigade, the Zulu War, and indeed the First World War. For the British soldiers, their primary task was building an empire and holding on to that empire. Over the years, from the time it first opened its gates in 1806, many very famous soldiers would serve within the barrack walls here. I suppose the first man to grace the barracks with his presence was the Duke of Wellington, an Irishman born in Dublin who would win fame as the commander of the Allied forces at the Battle of Waterloo, who inflicted a major defeat on Napoleon. Another man to serve within the barracks here in the 1830s was Colonel Brudendell. He later became the Earl of Cardigan and won fame, or I should say infamy, as the man who led the famous charge of the Light Brigade during the Crimean War. Another interesting character to serve here in the barracks was Colonel Pitt Rivers. He went on to become the father, considered to be by many as the father of modern archaeology. And many of the processes he developed when he was doing his archaeological digs around Cork are currently today used by archaeologists all over the world. But as the 19th century moved on and a number of wars were taking place, there was a necessity to expand the barracks. And around 1849 and 1850, there was a major construction program undertaken here in the barracks. A hospital was added, a church was added. The church itself has a fascinating history. It was built around 1849 and between 1849 and 1850. And when it was first opened its doors, the services held there were Church of Ireland and Presbyterian. But in addition to that, it also served as a school for the children of the British garrison that were here in barracks. During the week, Monday to Friday, primary and secondary classes were held. Primary ones, I believe, were held up in the balcony, and secondary classes were held down in the main body of the church. The church itself holds a treasure that many of the people of Cork are completely unaware of, and that takes the form of 5 stained glass windows by the noted stained glass artist E.V. Hone. The windows themselves are absolutely beautiful, and people with an interest in stained glass from all over the world have travelled here to the barracks to see them and to photograph them and to record their presence here in the church. A military detention barracks, which was outside the barracks walls but part of the installation, was also added. Various stores, more living accommodation was also constructed there at the time. Again, this was seen in response to the threat that the military authorities felt existed at the time. And of course, this was the era of the Fenians. The Fenians had just were actually forming there at the time as well, and rebel Cork was starting to get a bit rebellious. So the barracks actually had a twofold mission at the time. Not alone did it serve as a staging post for the troops heading off to fight in colonial conflicts or other major wars that were taking part in the 19th century, but its garrison was also here to ensure that the people of Cork, and indeed the people of Munster, remained loyal to the British Crown. Its very existence served as a warning to the people that they did not dare challenge the authority of Britain. But after the Boer War, the garrison here settled into a pretty much peacetime existence. But in August 1914, all of that would change. On the 4th of August, Britain entered the conflict developing in Europe that grew and became known as the Great War or the First World War. And here in Cork, the barracks would prove to be a major recruiting centre for thousands of young men who passed through its gates, who answered the call for recruits, came here to the barracks, conducted their training, and went off to fight from Cork in many of the war's big battles, like the Battle of the Somme, Gallipoli, Salonika, the Middle East, Mesopotamia, all of those places. Like I said, there would have been thousands of young men passed here. And at the end of the war, sadly to say, over 4,200 men with Cork connections lost their lives in that conflict. And that would have a major, major impact on the feeling and the thinking of the people they left behind in the political developments that would follow the end of the war. While young men were coming up to the barracks in training and heading off to fight in the Great War, another military force also existed in Cork at the time. The introduction of the Third Home Rule Bill in April 1912 led to a crisis here in Ireland. It led in northeast Ulster to the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force, an armed paramilitary group determined to fight the introduction of Home Rule by armed force if necessary. Their establishment alarmed the nationalist population of Ireland, and in November 1913, a nationalist paramilitary force was formed known as Uglag na hÉireann, or the Irish Volunteers. On the 14th of December then, a meeting was held in the City Hall in Cork to form a Cork City Corps of volunteers. By September 1914, the volunteer movement consisted of 182,000 members. The vast majority of the volunteers, 170,000 or so, believed in what Redmond was saying, and many of them, over 30,000, went on to join the British Armed Forces and fight in the war. The minority, the more separatist-minded minority, around 12,000 or so, refused to believe that the volunteers should be doing Britain's bidding. They believed that the volunteers were there to serve the people of Ireland. They saw themselves as a fledgling Irish army. So the movement split. Those who followed Redmond became known as the National Volunteers, and the separatist Republican element retained the title of Uglag na hÉireann, or Irish Volunteers. And as I said, they saw themselves as servants to the Irish people, existing to fight for the interest of Ireland and indeed for the freedom of Ireland. And that desire for freedom manifested itself in April 1916 when the volunteers rose up in Dublin, occupied the General Post Office and other buildings, and when Patrick Pearse proclaimed the establishment of an independent Irish Republic. The Cork Brigade never actually took part in the Easter Rising. It wasn't because they didn't want to, it was because that in the week before the Rising, there was a whole series of conflicting orders emanating from the volunteer headquarters in Dublin, effectively saying the Rising is on, it's off, it's on, it's off. And that led to huge confusion in the minds of Tomás McCurtain, who was the commanding officer, and Terence McSweeney, who was his second in command.
So following that, the Irish Volunteers retreated into their headquarters on Shear Street, the Irish Volunteer Hall, which they barricaded and kind of armed themselves, and they had armed men inside. And here at the barracks became kind of the counter force to that.
Artillery was placed on the hills above which is now Granabraher, which was just countryside at the time, and a threat was issued that if the volunteers rose, they would be taken on, challenged, and artillery would be used to shell the city. McCurtain effectively was in a hopeless position.
And that led to a standoff that lasted for about a week. And then eventually the standoff ended through an intercession between the Bishop of Cork, the Lord Mayor of Cork, and apparently a pretty flexible Irish officer who was their military intelligence officer. And together they came to a kind of satisfactory conclusion where the volunteers handed over their weapons to the Lord Mayor. But so as a result of that, eventually about a week later, orders came to the barracks to arrest prominent Irish volunteer leaders, including Terence McSweeney and Tomas McCurtain, and they were brought up here and then eventually transferred over to Britain. And originally when they were kind of marched up here, there were descriptions of the families of soldiers kind of booing and hissing them as they were kind of marched into the barracks.
But on the morning of the 2nd of May, a force consisting of members of the Royal Irish Constabulary travelled to Castlelyons in North Cork and surrounded the home of the Kent family in Bernard out there, because the Kent brothers who were there at the time, Thomas, David, William and Richard, were known Republicans. Police
attempted to disarm them. They resisted. One of the brothers was shot dead there. A policeman was shot dead. And the surviving Kent brothers were brought here to the barracks, kind of marched over Fermoy Bridge and then brought here. And eventually Thomas Kent was executed here.
Over the years, Thomas Kent's grave in the military detention barracks and indeed Cork Prison became a place of pilgrimage for his family members and indeed for members of the defence forces located here in the barracks. And in 1966, on the 50th anniversary of the Rising, a headstone that was crafted by the well-known Cork sculptor Seamus Murphy was erected over the site of his grave. In 2015, after 99 years, the remains of Thomas Kent were located and disinterred because the prison was about to be closed. They were taken here to the church in the barracks, where they lay in state, and almost 10,000 people passed through the barrack gate that night and visited and paid their respects to Thomas Kent. And the following day, he was given a state funeral and buried in the family vault on the grounds of St. Nicholas Church in Castlelyons. And I suppose that was the last bit of unfinished business in respect of the 1916 Rising. And after his remains were exhumed and reinterred in the family vault in Castlelyons, the Kent family graciously decided to donate the headstone here to the barracks because of the connection they had built up with the garrison over the years. It's here outside the garrison church where it serves as a visual reminder of the huge sacrifice made by Thomas Kent in the cause of Irish freedom.
You know, throughout its history, one of the reasons you have a big military presence in the city is to prevent potential domestic violence, domestic unrest. So the barracks would have been, the soldiers who were stationed at the barracks here were occasionally deployed to help the civil authorities and to help the police maintain order. So one of the first manifestations of unrest after the Easter Rising were a series of street riots. And the worst of them was called the Battle of Patrick Street. And troops were actually deployed into the city, and they actually set up machine guns on the Grand Parade and Patrick Street and threatened to fire into the crowds. And that happened on a couple of occasions where troops, armed soldiers, would be deployed into the city center when the Royal Irish Constabulary could no longer control mobs, and so they would threaten to fire into them. And that occurred on a number of occasions in 1917, 1918, 1919. But you also see throughout this period an increased militarization of governance. And as military forces are used to govern the Irish people, there's a lot of resentment of that, and it also kind of changes attitudes towards the military as well.
So it was a day of great hope, a great expectation that Ireland would finally be a new independent nation and that its people would control its destiny. That same day, however, in a place called Solohead Beg in Tipperary, a more radical element of the Irish Volunteers felt that armed force would be the only way that an independent republic could be established, and they decided to act. On the day that the Dáil was meeting, a group of volunteers from Tipperary ambushed 2 members of the Royal Irish Constabulary escorting a consignment of gelignite to a nearby quarry and shot them dead. That incident is seen to be the start of what became known as Ireland's War of Independence. Because despite the wishes of the Irish people, and indeed of the TDs who met in Dublin that historic day, the 21st of January, Britain would not give Ireland its independence. It didn't recognise the Dáil, it didn't recognise the democratic wishes of the Irish people, and the British government remained determined to govern Ireland from Westminster. And within a few months, the country became engulfed in an armed conflict where the forces of the Republic, the Irish Volunteers or Irish Republican Army, or IRA as they soon became known, took on the forces of the Crown, the Royal Irish Constabulary and the British Army.
The importance of Victoria Barracks during the War of Independence was that it was the administrative centre for the British Crown forces in Munster. So all of Munster, all the operations, all the deployments, all the troops, all the military law was all administered here.
And opposing them in the county, you had 3 brigades of the Irish Republican Army. You had Cork No. 1 Brigade, commanded by Thomas McCurtain, which covered the middle of the county. Cork No. 3 Brigade, which was commanded by Charlie Hurley, covered West Cork. And Cork No. 2 Brigade in North Cork, commanded by Liam Lynch.
So the IRA in Cork City had a good reputation nationally and regionally because they had really sophisticated intelligence operations going on, and they kept this barracks under pretty close surveillance as well as they could.
The IRA, because of its inferior strength and inferior armaments, knew they were never going to take on the forces of the Crown by conventional means. So they had to resort to the tactics of guerrilla warfare. The war intensified, and it didn't really impact much on Cork until 1920. And that year, the city and county of Cork became, in effect, the eye of the storm. Here in the city, on the 20th of March 1920, Thomas McCurtain, who had been elected Lord Mayor of Cork in January, who was also commander of Cork No. 1 Brigade, was shot dead in the early hours of his home on the 20th of March in front of his wife and young children by a renegade element of the Royal Irish Constabulary. That event shook, I suppose, the Republican leadership to its foundations. It shocked the people of Ireland, and it drew the attention of the world to what was happening here in Ireland, and indeed here in Cork. McCurtain was succeeded by his close friend and comrade, Terence McSweeney, both as Lord Mayor of Cork and indeed as officer commanding Cork No. 1 Brigade at the time. McSweeney was found to be in possession of a police cipher, and he was taken up. All of those arrested were taken up here to the barracks. All of them except McSweeney, I should say, were released. McSweeney was detained here in the barracks and court-martialed for being in possession of that cipher. As was the practice at the time, he would have been divested of all his personal possessions. The one item he refused to part with at the time was the chain of office. So he stood for his court-martial wearing that chain of office, which is the chain of office that the Lord Mayors, his successors of Lord Mayor, right up until the present day, have continued to wear with great pride. McSweeney was found guilty of effectively sedition and sentenced to 2 years in prison. When he received his sentence, he informed the court that he had been refusing food, that he had joined a hunger strike that was taking place here in Cork Jail by other Republicans, and he would continue to do so until either he was released or he died. He was subsequently moved to Brixton Prison in London and continued his hunger strike there. And as each day passed, McSweeney's sacrifice, his slow, lingering, painful death focused the eyes of the world upon his prison cell. And as they focused upon McSweeney's sacrifice, the wider story of the conflict that was taking place in Ireland also was brought to people's notice. The death of McSweeney and McCurtain, like I said, focused the eyes of the world on the conflict in Ireland, and more particularly the conflict that was taking place here in Cork. But worse would follow. When the War of Independence started, the British government were determined that it would be seen as a police conflict, that the members of the Royal Irish Constabulary wouldn't be taking on an army, but they would be taking on what the British government called a murder gang, effectively criminals. They didn't want the British Army to become involved because that would militarise the conflict and give the IRA some sort of military status, which they were determined to deny them. They proved to be quite ineffective. They were ill-disciplined. They weren't trained properly as policemen. These men were soldiers who had been just back, for the most part they were soldiers, who had just endured years of vicious conflict on the Western Front. And many of them brought the tactics and strategy that they employed in open warfare here to Ireland. It was a disaster. It was a publicity disaster for the British. They weren't proven effective. They weren't bringing the fight to the IRA as the British government had hoped. So Winston Churchill, in response to this predicament, Winston Churchill conceived the idea of recruiting ex-British officers with combat experience into the police force, into the Royal Irish Constabulary. They would be members of that police force, but they would be separate. And they became known as the Auxiliary Division of the RIC. And their task was simple. They were told to crush terror with terror. And at the end of October, at the start of November 1920, K Company of the Auxiliary Division arrived here in Cork under the command of Colonel Owen Latimer. He was a retired Royal officer from the Royal Air Force. They were billeted here in the barracks, in the gymnasium, separate from the military. Okay, they were a police force comprised of all officers with combat experience.
And they took a lot of they were the kind of tip of the spear in terms of interacting with the IRA, but they were constantly supported by troops.
And they commenced operations pretty quickly after arriving, setting up checkpoints, searching people on Patrick Street, insulting them, putting them up against the wall, raiding homes of Republican sympathisers, and so on. A challenge to that authority was very quick in coming, because on the following night, members of the 1st Battalion of Cork No. 1 Brigade set up an ambush some 200 or so yards away from the barracks down at Dillon's Cross. And around 7 or 7:30 that evening, 2 lorries of auxiliaries left the barrack gate. As they passed towards Dillon's Cross, they were attacked by members of A Company in a very successful ambush. 12, I think it was, were seriously wounded, and 1 cadet died of his wounds afterwards. The auxiliaries here in the barracks were outraged by this. The British military were outraged by this. Members of the RAC were outraged by this, and their vengeance wasn't long in coming. The Fire Brigade, which had very primitive equipment by today's standards, led by Captain Hudson, made heroic efforts to contain the flames, to stop the whole city becoming engulfed in fire. But every attempt they made to fight the fire was hindered by the forces of the Crown, the auxiliaries. They bayoneted the hoses, they fired shots over the heads of the firemen, but they still persevered and done their level best to save their city from destruction.
Now, the city was under military law. That meant the British Army was in control and administered law and order in the city. And the British Army here made no effort to stop the burning that was going on. Soldiers weren't really involved officially, although there's reports of some of them being involved who might have been off duty, just kind of getting in on the fun and joining the looting that was going on. But the big thing was that by not acting, the British military authorities showed that they were acquiescing, or at least weren't willing to intervene to stop this. The impact was immediate in terms of the economic impact. It was 2,000 people thrown out of work overnight, and it outraged Cork public opinion. Because keep in mind that the Crown forces have been claiming that they represented law and order and they represented normalcy, and here they're uniformed agents of the state are committing arson, murder, theft, and property crime in broad daylight. No one's stopping them. So how does that that makes you question the legitimacy of your government.
Early in 1921, I think it became apparent to both the British government and indeed many leading Irish Republican politicians that a military victory for either side was pretty much unachievable. The treaty, sadly, would prove to be more divisive here in Ireland, and while it might have brought one war to an end, it would also lead to another war.
And so British forces withdrew almost immediately, but there were a few places where the British government retained forces in case they needed them. So Victoria Barracks was one of the last places outside of Dublin to be evacuated. And so you had troops here very late until May 1922, because Cork was seen as a potential hotspot for resistance to the treaty, and the government wanted to retain kind of a force here in case they needed to use them. The British soldiers marched out behind their band in full equipment down to the waiting ships down at the docks. They cut down the flagpole so that to avoid the embarrassment of an Irish tricolor to be raised while they were still on the base or in the city. And that was apparently standard procedure for them when they pulled out of base. It wasn't just an anti-Irish thing. But they pulled out, handed over their keys to a representative of the National Army, the Free State Army, who then handed over the keys to a representative of the anti-treaty IRA, the Cork No. 1 Brigade, and they marched in behind a bagpipe band in kind of their own unofficial uniform of flat caps and leggings, looking as spruced up as they could. But apparently the streets were lined with people cheering them as they came in, and people kind of throwing their hats in the air, because it was a real symbol of the end of kind of British governance. Even though that was also going to be a symbol of coming violence in the Civil War.
Sadly, the following month, the tensions that had been building up between the different elements within the Republican movement erupted into violence with the shelling of the forecourts on the 20th of June 1922, an act that started the sad chapter of Irish history known as the Civil War.
The anti-treaty IRA were operating in the city and in the county and in Munster, basically, and they controlled the province for about 6 or 8 weeks after the start of the Civil War. Now that changed when National Army troops landed at Passage West, and then there was a 3-day fight down in kind of Rochestown, Douglas. So as the National Army approached Cork City, the IRA prepared to evacuate. So they were pulling out of the city, they were kind of withdrawing, and they didn't want to leave military assets for the National Army who were pursuing them. So they set fire to police stations and to major places that could be garrisoned, like Victoria Barracks. So they had kind of a plan in place. They had big drums full of gasoline, and basically when they knew that the order was given to withdraw from the city, they set fire to this building, these structures, but also different barracks, police barracks, and kind of potential places. So the whole city apparently was covered in smoke.
And it was, I suppose, another one of the most historic acts in the history of the barracks, because having survived unscathed various conflicts in Republican agitation and the rest of it, the barracks would fall to a conflict that involved Irishmen fighting on both sides.
As those fires were taking place and as the IRA withdrew, a lot of local residents kind of descended on the barracks and started taking whatever they could get their hands on. Just things like wood, things like beds, blankets.
So when the National Army moved in and occupied this location here, all they found were a wreck, charred buildings, furniture that was smouldering, and was uninhabitable, basically.
So when the National Army comes in, they start to use the barracks here as a staging post, as an administrative center. They pitched some tents here, and they used it to station troops, and they were deployed throughout the city, but a lot of their headquarters and their administrative tail would have been located here. And so that's kind of when they took possession.
And over the years, a slow but steady program of rebuilding would take place that would ultimately see the barracks restored to much of its former glory. So in June 1940, as the war spread rapidly throughout Europe, Eamon de Valera, who was Taoiseach at the time, issued what became known as the call to arms at a public rally in Dublin, calling upon young men all over the country to join the Defence Force, to take part in the defence of their country. This proved to be very successful, and thousands of young men all over Ireland rushed to their nearest military barracks to enlist. And here, the barracks, which had been named Collins Barracks in 1925 in honour of Michael Collins, once again would become a major centre of training and administration.
When you think about the history of Cork, it really becomes a major city during this Napoleonic era. And that's also when the barracks are built. And so the prominence of the barracks kind of follows with the prominence of the city. And so, and at the height of kind of, this is a major British military presence by the First World War, and then it kind of goes into decline, but now it's regained a lot of its former prominence. The defense forces that are situated here are, well equipped and very professional, and so in a lot of ways it reflects the health of the governance, the health of the Irish Republic as a state and the legitimacy of the state, and it is different, but not totally separate from what came before it. There's probably some kind of continuity there.
What goes on a day-to-day basis, first of all, are the operations that we carry out. So the provision of personnel for guards in first of all, the security of the barracks itself, but also for other stuff like Portlaoise Prison, Shannon Airport, and also then training for overseas and contributing to overseas missions.
Aid to the civil power of the police forces. We're always involved with police forces, VVIPs that enter into the country. We assist the Gardaí.
I don't think they're fully aware of what actually goes on a daily basis, but we're always operational and we get 24 hours readiness to deploy in any situation.
We do searches in aid of the guards, that either technical with our engineers or just for bodies, looking for people. And also we aid the civil authority, the local county councils. For example, a good example was the storms that we had, Ophelia, and we use our capabilities to assist getting people and getting patients to hospital, getting staff to hospital. Our engineers have flat-bottom boats to extract people from flooded areas, the manual labour, building sandbag walls, whatever.
We could have got calls there from City Hall when there was flooding going on. We sent out a party with 500 or 600 sandbags full. We had 2,000 sandbags filled at all times at the back of the barracks there in the yard on pallets that would be lifted. There was always a truck or 2 trucks with the pallets on them full of sandbags to move immediately while the others were being got ready to come down.
In peacetime and in times of good times, that people don't countenance defence forces the same way. But when there are difficulties, for instance, if there's a flood today in the city, the first place they'll call here is call the barracks and get out the heavy vehicles that they can drive through and rescue people.
It's that old historical relationship whereby the people in the city of Cork and the surrounding areas have come to rely on the defence forces in times, in times of extreme weather, in times of extreme difficulties. And I suppose that comforting feeling that when all else fails, we can call in the defence forces.
I always say to people, the first role is we're the soldiers. So the soldiers from Collins Barracks come from Cork, Tipperary, Kerry, they come from the area. And because of the traits and the type of people we are, we like sports, we're into management and organisation. So at our communities, you will always find soldiers involved in the local communities, the GAA, the rugby, the athletics, because that's our traits, if you like. So we're plugged in at home. We're of the people. We belong to the community. It's not that we're separate.
There's no 2 days the same, and it's exciting because there's training, and we're training outside of barracks. We're training in Kilworth Camp or the Glen of Amalor or wherever. But it certainly is, we pack our day in.
Basically, what the brigade, when it's not engaged in operations, its primary focus, its secondary focus is training and preparation for such operations. So it starts at the very basic level of induction of young soldiers in as recruits to become 2-star soldiers, moving on to their 3-star training. And currently we have a course here, which is the Potential NCOs course here in Collins Barracks, which will finish in August, where young soldiers, young privates now become NCOs. And there are a series of career courses which people can avail of right throughout their careers. But in the Defence Forces in general, we have placed a huge emphasis on training and education. We say that you train for the known and you educate for the unknown.
So this morning we covered CPR on an adult, no breathing, no responsiveness and no pulse. Straight into CPR, which is what? What's the ratio? 30 to 2, yeah, 30 compressions, 2 breaths. So I'm involved in a course called an MF4 course, which stands for Military First Responders course. It's conducted by the Central Medical Unit 1 Brigade, which is located in Collins Barracks here. And we're basically training a potential NCOs course on that course, Military First Responders course, for future operations at home or abroad in the event of emergency activities or emergency care.
Well, this is Lynch Camp, situated just outside Kilworth and outside of Collins Barracks in Cork. And essentially what it is, it's 3,000 acres of military lands where we do shooting, tactical exercises, fitness and endurance testing for the soldiers of the Irish Defence Forces.
Just moving forward, contact, okay, so we're sweeping forward. We know there's enemy out there, okay. You may hear gunfire coming back with the sound simulators and that. So again, you're pushing forward. There's other actors in the area as well.
So today we're in Kilworth Military Ranges. It's a training area for the Defence Forces. What goes on here is live fire training with gallery ranges, which are fixed target ranges, and then the live fire tactical training, which is what we have seen here today, where the troops are moving through greenfield areas and then they've got tactical targets to engage. The real objective is for the likes of overseas deployments or even in Ireland on prisoner escorts and cache escorts. If a live exercise or if live situation does occur, that the troops have confidence in their weapon, they'll have confidence in their accuracy. They'll know when they hit their targets because they'll bob down and bob back up again. And also it'll give them that confidence, so going forward they'll know they'll have confidence in their weapon and their training.
Even this year we have troops coming, troops who are deploying to Lebanon and troops who are deploying to Syria will come here and they do parts of their pre-deployment training. So here they'll form up, they'll begin their fitness testing, they'll begin their weapons training, also their tactical training, and they'll use the environment here, similar scenarios that would they maybe encounter across when they're overseas or on deployment.
So the Defence Forces in general have a unique history and a unique record when it comes to peacekeeping. We have provided peacekeeping missions continuously since 1958.
The first large-scale deployment of members of the Defence Forces would have been in 1960 to the Congo.
And from 50 to 60 in the army, it was very predictable every month and every year. It was very predictable. You had shooting teams, commanding officers, parades, inspections, training, and every year was the same. So I suppose when an opportunity came to put all this training into practice, every fella put his hand up. And like there was no talk of overseas allowances, nothing about money, nothing. We were badly equipped for it. But people, volunteers, and I mentioned the training there. All the training we had done, I think, paid off because when we were out there, we were well trained and well equipped to carry out our duties. So, as I said, we volunteered, and it was an exciting time. I was married in '54, and I had to go home and tell my wife, and I was afraid to say I was going for 6 months. I said I was going away for 24 weeks, I remember, to make it easier. Then our uniforms we wore a grey shirt, buttoned-up tunic that time, you know, and big heavy brown boots with studs and gaiters, totally unsuitable, you know. There was a sergeant said to me in Wheelers Air Base, an American sergeant, said, "You guys going to the North Pole?" You know, we were dressed that way.
The Bull's wool jacket uniform used from 1940 to 62. Now, 1962, so we're talking the first large-scale deployment to the Congo in 1960, so that's what they would have worn in the Congo. So you can imagine just even to function in that kind of a uniform would have been very, very difficult.
And here were young men dropped into the jungle after being here a couple of days beforehand and carried on their duties after they were there all their lives. Highly efficient and capable young people. And the day you land at a UN mission, you know, you're there in a situation where there is conflict. So there's tension all the time. And you have to appreciate, I don't know if people appreciate this very much, soldiers overseas have this tension and conflict. You're in a war zones, wherever you are, you can be killed.
A very important role army doctors would have are taking care of the scars that some of our patients, and a lot of them, would have got while serving overseas or at home from traumatic experiences. And that is in the care of their mental health as well, that they can deal with some of the very, very shocking experiences they've had to deal with.
Well, I suppose one of the biggest things that I found, and a lot of fellas found because we were young enough as well at the time, is that you see families there that are torn asunder. Their children killed, bodies on the road, and nobody's then would have to collect them and take them away, you know. That was terrific. So I suppose we fell in favour with the civilian population. But our job was there to mind those people and protect them at all times. And like when we even got there on the first day, the gratitude from these people and the smiles on their face that they saw us was unbelievable.
When we arrived at the beginning, I mean, basically primary care had broken down in South Lebanon. So we had to fill in the spaces. And that's when we, as well as, while our primary duty is to our soldiers and to our colleagues, we also are very much involved in the care and the structure and the building up of the care of the society around us.
But our duty is to keep the peace, and to keep the peace, they have to take a lot of chances doing that. There's a lot of risk in doing that. You're going into conflict situations to try and save situations from getting worse. And I've witnessed a lot of this, and our soldiers are brilliant at it.
My father, Anthony Connolly, he went out with the 33rd Infantry Battalion B Company in 1960, and he served over there for a stint of 6 months. While he was there was a war broke out between the Balupas and the Cantigese forces. So the Baluba tribesmen were out on the ground and they were slaughtering a lot of people. So he made a decision to go out into the battlefield, climb a tree to the highest point and set up communications at the top of the tree. He was an expert in communications through Morse code. He served in First Field Signals, and that's the platoon he was out with, the Signals Company. So he set up that mission on the top of the tree, and when he executed the mission to get the aircrafts in, he got 4 aircrafts in to get the people out. So he did his Morse code through Irish, to execute the mission, because the Belugas and the County forces had been able to intercept the Morse code. So he was smarter than them, and the Irish won through in the end when he got over 200 people off the ground through aircrafts, and the last plane that went out there was 83 women and children. So he was he got a Distinguished Service Medal for that. I was very proud of him.
Part of the reason that we are so recognised worldwide as regards peacekeeping is that we don't have any colonial baggage. We are very impartial. Our temperament is of a cool temperament, ideal for peacekeeping. Peacekeeping sometimes can be described as more difficult than war fighting, in that you're dealing with perhaps two sides and you don't know where you lie, whereas in war fighting it's A versus B, winner takes all. So there's that element of it, and it is very important from our perspective that we continue with that type of record, and we will do so.
And it's about projecting Irishness as much as a militariness. And we have a lot of history of conflict, but more importantly, conflict resolution. And they're the traits that we bring overseas. You know, we understand both sides of an argument, the Troubles, the Civil War. You know, there's a lot of history that my grandparents, my great-grandparents have lived through over the last 100 years that are just the tools that we use overseas to conflict resolution. We know that there's solutions. We know by communication, by talking, you can defuse. And a lot of the time it's just about talking and listening to people.
From 1960 right up until the present, there's not a single day has passed without a member of the Irish Defence Forces manning their positions in one of the trouble spots of the world. And I suppose it's hard to gauge the success or otherwise of their mission, but a good way would be to ask the question, how many people in those war-torn countries are alive today because of the presence of a member or members of the Irish Defence Forces?
There's a huge respect, I think, for the Defence Forces, and it's always been displayed, certainly by various Lord Mayors and various members of the council here. They've always highly respected the Defence Forces, and Defence Forces have always played a huge role in trying to be helpful in any way that they can to the city here. So I think there's a huge link here, and the band has certainly played a great role in that connection.
I think it has a very positive relationship with the city. Number one, it's one of the big employers of the city. People forget that, I mean. And it is also involved, I think, in the city in many ways, both from, let's call it a broad cultural sense, be that games, or be it from a musical sense.
Most people in the city will have heard the band or seen the band at some stage. I mean, I don't think there's anybody you could go into the city and say, have you ever heard of the Army bands? And they will say no. We do play in the city on an odd occasion. During the summer we do a series of summertime concerts in Fitzgerald's Park.
You have the Mass Bands concert, which the tickets go on sale to the whole city if they want to buy them. And the city hall is full.
So we run a gala concert every year, usually at the end of February. It was the beginning of March this year, which is a benefit concert for the Army Benevolent Fund.
It's our highlight of the year. It's very well supported for us. It's, I think it's great for the city. It's great for us.
I just love performing, and I think I get a kick out of performing, and there's nothing like a live performance, really.
Collins Barracks sports is absolutely a vital element of, not only in Collins Barracks but in all of our military establishments. We have fantastic sports facilities here. We have a modern gymnasium.
Well, we try to do a broad branch of say industry standard classes. So we would do spinning, we would do say your normal like kettlebells. We have boxing classes coming on. We do yoga. We'd also do mixed classes, say like your soccer training. We do weights classes, and we'd also do running classes as well.
We have a full pitch across in the camp field, just across the road. We have all-weather pitches down there as well. And the barracks contributes, and takes part and participates in all of the Defence Forces events and in a number of events locally within Cork City as well.
Boxing in the 40s and 50s here was the top sport in the barracks. Top sport. Just fantastic boxers come out of here.
They've volleyball teams, they've soccer teams, they've camogie teams for the women.
I've played camogie all my life. I play both for Cork Senior Camogie team and with my club, St Finbarrs. So the training is quite extensive. It's 4 or 5 days a week. Most of the time in the barracks that I've spent for the last few years have been quite robust training-wise. So the military environment definitely has helped me to perform on the pitch, and vice versa. I think the camogie, the sport all my life, has helped me within the military, so it does go hand in hand.
Army people would have contributed a lot to rugby, both Sunday as well, for instance, Dolphin and Cork Constitution, and then in the various hurling clubs such as the Glen and Brian Dillon's.
But it just doesn't stop there. The soccer, basketball, you've got rugby, everything from martial arts, boxing, rowing, swimming, everything. And now I suppose with the sports like marathon running, adventure racing and all that's becoming quite popular, that you've got those sports are really starting to come to the fore. Orienteering is a big thing in the Defence Forces, so you've got a whole array of sports.
Collins Barracks means a lot to me, and that it's been a kind of not just a workplace, it's the whole life that goes on inside in a barracks, and the people that are involved and the characters.
To me, Collins Barracks is like a second home, and I feel in the army you build up a second family. Like, there is great camaraderie.
So Collins Barracks was has a fierce tradition of families. Number one in the barracks, coming into the army, fathers, sons, now daughters in some cases.
And it has been the case with my own son, James, who also decided to follow in my footsteps, in the footsteps of my father and grandfather, and joined the Defence Forces to pursue a military career.
As I was growing up, when I was in school, I'd finish school, I'd come home, I'd do my hurling and football, I'd do my training, and to see my father come home from work, even his dress, his deportment, his demeanour, his attitude, his personality from the Defence Forces as to how he was trained, it was like my own personal idol of a person to look up to. His various trips overseas, how tough it was in his family. We were growing up, the absence of, whether it be away in a course, up the country, overseas, etc. It was a brilliant eye-opener to me, learning that if I joined the Defence Forces, I can learn discipline, I can learn dress, deportment, demeanour, I can have my fitness opportunities, and there's ample opportunities within the Defence Forces that I could pursue my career with learning from my father and hopefully at a better stage be in the footsteps of him.
Well, I joined the army in June of 1981, and we were the very first female recruit platoon to be taken in. We did every single thing that was expected of the men. We did the same. And when we had to do ground exercises in Kilworth, there was packs to be carried and guns to be carried and whatever was to be done, and it was tough going out on the ground. But we found that the lads actually wanted to help us. It was like an automatic reaction, but we were very strong in wanting to prove that we could do it ourselves. And I think we did very well. But sure, women have every role in the army now, the same as the men.
Females marching people and being in an authority role when I joined the Defence Forces was not really the majority. So I had seen a female one time marching soldiers, and I said, you know what, I'm going to do that, and that was it. And I kind of wanted to be in the battalion. We were given the opportunity to be on the front line with the male soldiers. There was no difference whatsoever. I had seen other aspects in the Defence Forces that women were in other jobs that you mightn't have seen them, whereas in the battalion we were definitely, we trained with them and everything was exactly the same. Weight bearing, carrying the same amount of time that you were on the ground, whatever weapons there was females on it, males on it, and that I liked instantly.
Men and of the barracks obviously would mostly have lived in the community. There was a small married quarters here up to the 1970s.
Well, we grew up there. I was 4 when I moved in,
and our dads were in the army, of course, and I lived there then from age 4 to 17, and childhood was all about the barracks, and growing up there we had a great time. And I lived down there, number 2 block, 2 stories. We had a great view because we were up high. I remember the sunbeam over there, Fardmead Church there, and Shandon.
Yeah.
But the view was brilliant.
And then there was the 5th block, which I lived on. We'll say it was here, and behind there would have been we had long, beautiful gardens, and we used to, you know, put the clothes out in the line, and they'd be blowing away in the nice weather.
Well, I suppose in this vicinity of all around the area of the barracks, you know, you have the people that would attend mass here. So, like, it was part of the community for them.
Local people are in my time, were very welcome here, and I must say the army was brilliant. But like, around here there is a little community. There has been a great bond always between the priests of the parish and the people. We work at a different level in the army, but you have that contact with people all the time, and you know, people always need to have someone that they can talk to. The specific role then of the priest as well would be to say mass and to administer the sacraments. And since Ireland has become very much involved in overseas service, one of the big roles of the chaplain in the army today is to serve overseas with the soldiers.
But I do think that maybe in other parts of the city, no one ever really knew what went on inside the walls of the barracks.
As a young girl, for sure, I was blown away about the volume of the size. And even now, I suppose being 20 years in and being front of house now in the officers' mess, when the civilians come in, the first thing they do, which is funny to me, they come into this massive, beautiful building. They look out the window because they want to see what's around. They can't understand what goes on here, you know, can you tell us what's in?
I think it's incumbent on us in the Defence Forces in Collins Barracks, and we have started a while back in trying to remove, as we call them, the virtual walls. Many years ago, what happened in barracks was behind the large barrack walls. Everything we do now is in an effort to inform the public as to what we do, to make them more aware of what we do.
Members of the public here in Cork City are afforded the opportunity of accessing the museum here in Collins Barracks as they would Cork Public Museum. And they get a very good insight into the history of Óglacht na hÉireann and our overseas service, talking about 1960, the Congo, the Lebanon, Chad, different overseas missions that the Defence Forces have been deployed on, and in some cases still are actually deployed. So we would hope that it would give them a sense that of the work that the Defence Forces do on behalf of the people of Ireland, be it with the United Nations, but it also gives them an opportunity to sit in the viewing area. We're now in the viewing room here in the museum. What's special about this location is it affords people that come through the civilian access gate the opportunity to look out into the barracks and see what may happen on a day-to-day basis. There's a preservation order on all the buildings surrounding the square. So from a member of the public's point of view, it's exactly as it was when the barracks opened in 1806. It's the same now as it was then.
Today is Friday, the 20th of September 2019, and we're standing in the latest exhibition that was added to the Barrack Museum in Collins Barracks in Cork. It's the Hall of Heroes, and this particular exhibition honours all members who served in units in this barracks who were awarded 4 particular medals: the Military Star, the Military Medal of Gallantry, the Distinguished Service Medal, and the Jadaville Medal. And the intention was that not alone would this tell the story of those individuals to visitors to the museum and remind them actually of the role in the history of Defence Forces, but we also hoped that this exhibition would also serve to inspire young members of the garrison and to remind them in a tangible way that when they come into the Defence Forces and they walk in this barracks, they're walking in the footsteps of heroes.
I think it's very important to remember people who have made a major contribution to the Defence Forces. In particular, to remember the people who have given their lives for the Defence Forces. We have a vast number of people, over the 80s I believe now, who have died in service overseas alone. And some of them in very serious operational situations, and I was unfortunately a witness to some of that myself when I was battalion commander overseas. So from that perspective, I think it's extremely important for the families here today, more so than old soldiers like me. The families are people who have given great service and who now are being acknowledged.
Well, I'm from Galway. My brother, Private Stephen Griffin, was 21 years of age. He celebrated his 21st birthday in the Lebanon. You know, they came under fire. I'm not very au fait with the ins and outs, the details of everything, but we were informed on, it was an Easter Monday, I'll never forget, it was an Easter Monday morning, and that he had been shot and severely injured. Died 7 days later, and fittingly donated his organs. Any viable organs were donated. Ironically, 2 of his organs were given to different side of the factions that actually were at war there. But today we're here at the launch of the Hall of Heroes here in Collins Barracks, and I had never met Adrian before. I had met Michael Daly, the medic, who had been on that mission, and I'm delighted and very privileged to meet Adrian, and really appreciate and publicly would like to state that we appreciate all the help, and realise how dangerous their mission was, and they go there not anticipating what's going to happen, and they never know, as Adrian said, they never know the day or the hour.
A lot of these incidents were forgotten over the last number of years. It's very, very important that they're not forgotten, and they're now finding a proper place, like here in the museum. And it's a good thing for the young soldiers to see that there's a different size to a military life. Military life is not the easiest. There are dark sides and there are very good sides.
My name is Aidan O'Halloran. I joined the Naval Service in 1981, and I was on duty in Cork Harbour on a naval vessel proceeding from Cove back to the naval base when one of the servicemen went overboard. I went into the water to try and save the chap. So as a result of that, then I received the Distinguished Service Medal with merit.
We were in Lebanon, 79, and in the middle of the night our camp was attacked, and so that is how I
The Hall of Heroes is absolutely beautiful. I mean, it's such an honour for us to be here for our dad, but it must be a great honour for those that are actually alive and can witness the recognition for their service to Ireland and to the United Nations, and for those that lost their life and their families here today. It's absolutely fantastic, spectacular day.
All I can say really is that for everybody who's looking at this is that it was a fantastic career, and I loved every minute of it, and I never would change it. And everybody's still here today. Just keep enjoying it.
It's wonderful to work with soldiers and colleagues. They're just a different breed of people, very supportive. You obviously have your little tete-a-tetes from time to time, but by and large, even still, you meet people down at Patrick Street, and it's hail fellow, well met. So it was very enjoyable, I must say. It was a pleasure.
38 years is my whole life, if you like, and I've given that to the army, but because I loved it.
You don't have to be great at everything. The army will see your strengths and weaknesses, and you will be developed, and you'll have the support system there, and that's what I love, is the support.
For a young person, it offers a fantastic variety of training, something different. It offers them opportunities for overseas. It offers them opportunities for training to a very high level in whatever area they choose themselves. It also offers them, in recent years, that opportunity that I alluded to earlier for further education.
Since it was first occupied in 1806, this barracks has changed from being a symbol of British imperial power to a symbol of Irish sovereignty. And the members of its garrison, be they soldiers of the Crown or soldiers of the Irish Republic, have all left their mark on the history of Cork, the history of Ireland, and indeed the history of the world. If the walls around me could talk, they would tell tales of sorrow and joy, of triumph and tragedy, of victory and defeat, and of repression and terror. And looking to the future, there is no doubt in my mind that as long as this barracks exists, that the members of its garrison, the men and women of Uglig na HÉireann, the Irish Defence Forces, will continue to serve their country by doing their duty to the best of their ability and facing whatever challenges come their way. And as they do so, together, they will all play their part in writing new chapters of the history of Collins Barracks, Cork.